Hi everybody and welcome back to the Wolves Fancast YouTube channel for your latest and final tactical analysis episode of the season for 22-23 with me, Gully. I've been racking my brains a little bit, to be honest, about what to do to kind of sum up what has been a really bizarre kind of rollercoaster of a year from a Wolves perspective. Finally kind of pulled together something. I did wonder if I wanted to go down kind of a data route to try and sum up what has happened to Wolves this year. And really, there've been so many different kind of ways you could look at it that it didn't make sense to essentially boil it down to a few points. If you did want to go and have a look at more of kind of a quantitative kind of view of Wolves this season so far, I did a thread on Twitter. You can find that in my pinned tweet at Molineux Musings on Twitter. So you can see a little bit more of the number side of things with some interesting points raised there. But I did just kind of think of it as a season of three phases, really. To start with Bruno Lage being in charge of the team and not lasting too long, obviously, with a bit of a slow start to the season. That kind of weird interim phase we had where Steve Davis and James Collins were running the side while we kind of hung around waiting for Julian Lopetegui. Almost wanted to appoint Michael Beale, got turned down by him and eventually got a hold of Lopetegui to take over the rest of the season going into the World Cup and the lull that kind of occurred from a club side perspective, obviously, around that time. And then Lopetegui eventually taking us through to the end of the season and finishing 13th. I mean, a lot has happened. We've had, a cup run almost by accident. We've had more VAR controversies and refereeing controversies than we've had probably in the last 4 or 5 years of Premier League football. And ultimately, it's led to safety. It's led to the aim that we had from Christmas, at least, not necessarily what we wanted to achieve at the start of the season, but a hell of a lot of question marks hanging over the club at the moment. But I'll take us through kind of where I kind of saw things chronologically. And if we have a look at Bruno Lage's tenure at the start of the season, take your minds back. It is quite a while ago now, thinking about it. I found myself kind of rewatching highlights of games just to kind of refamiliarize myself with how things went down. And I think that the decision making around Lage was obviously impacted by the way we ended last season as well. We kind of stumbled over the line, having been in a position to finish in Europe and ended up finishing in mid-table at the end of last season and having a few really poor kind of showings towards the end of that campaign. It didn't really start in the vein that we'd like to, from a results perspective at least. There was a transition to a back four, playing with a higher line. Obviously, the move away from the likes of Connor Cody, who had been stalwarts at the club up until that point. He tended to kind of favour a 4-2-3-1, 4-3-3. And really, from a defensive point of view, the way that Nathan Collins was integrated into the team, the way he and Max Kilman struck up a partnership to begin with was really promising. We conceded very few chances. If you wanted to have a look at the data on that will back that up as well. The problem being we created so few as well. And the fine margins that we kind of play on within the sport of football, because it is such a low scoring game, it makes you wonder if we took a couple of the chances that we had in some of those games. I think back to Tottenham away, where for the most part I think we outplayed them. We were the better side for the majority of that game, conceded a couple of chances maybe, but ultimately fell to Harry Kane and a decent set piece in that one. Leading 1-0 against Newcastle until very late on and gifting Alan Saint-Maximin a chance to score and him scoring a bit of a wonder goal there. But a couple of instances at the start of the season where things might have gone differently if we just taken the lead in a game. We think about Bournemouth away, having been slapped 9-0, I think it was, by Liverpool in the fixture prior. and then not going on to capitalise on what was a poor team who just lost their manager, and having chances again to win that game. The good work of the defence was really kind of let down by the attacking players within the team, and ultimately cost Bruno his job. There was some misfortune around kind of, like I say, missed chances, bad decision making in the final third. But I also think he really suffered with the late additions of Mateus Nunes and Gonzalo Guedes in particular. With regards to his summer transfer activity, it's fair to say, I think, that Bruno never really quite got a fair crack of the whip in the transfer market. And who knows what might have happened if he'd been given, a team to start pre-season with that he wanted to go and really kind of hit the ground running. And that first game against Leeds was testament to that, with a really kind of light bench, nothing available to Bruno to kind of change things. And it set the tone for the early part of the season. And I do think, whilst he was hard done by to a certain extent from a playing perspective, I don't think he set up a bad team. I think if you go back and watch the games, you will see a relatively well coached side that struggle to create things in the final third. That's all you can really boil it down to. We're not giving away lots of chances. We control possession. We're a bit methodical and slow with the way we pass the ball, but it's structured, it's well organised, it's well thought out. There's clear thought that has gone into the way the team is set up. He was just let down by his forward players, and I'll come on to mitigating factors as well a little bit later on. But the absence of a real kind of goal threat just really seemed to kill us, and some of the decision making around that from the club side as well is deserves questioning. But to then kind of go into that game against West Ham, having lost Nathan Collins to suspension, and continue with Ruben Neves at centre half, really kind of he didn't do himself any favours with that decision making, really. And Totti Gomez, who he ignored in that respect, went on to have a really good season in the end. But we move on to kind of Steve Davis and his short spell, 8 games in total if you look at it from an all competitions perspective. He tried to kind of lift the club, bring about a better atmosphere, increased intensity. We lost a little bit in terms of shape, in terms of solidity, in terms of a degree of resilience that we had through whatever methods Lard was employing from a defensive point of view. But he also introduced the likes of Hugo Bueno to the team, Joe Hodge. Like I say, Totti was reintegrated into the side, and Boubacar Traore actually started coming into the team a little bit more in starting games under Davis as well. And fans responded well to that. I think he kind of brought fans back on side from that perspective. But the fact of the matter is, Davis and Collins were limited in terms of their coaching abilities at the top level. There was a few occasions where we were outclassed. Brighton at home being one that sticks out like a sore thumb to me. Despite the kind of narrow scoreline, we were really kind of shell shocked with how good Brighton were. It was a really kind of interesting game to watch from that perspective. But the fact that we ended with 10 men, all those things all happened as a result of basically the top level of coaching that we came up against. And we felt a little bit rudderless, I think, at that point in time in the season. It was a difficult time. We obviously went through the whole managerial search debacle with Michael Beale potentially coming on, Julian Lopetegui not initially being available to us due to the ill health of his father, and the club not really trying knowing where they wanted to go with it. Actually being turned down by Beale at that point as well, and the rigmarole around that. Now, who knows? Maybe that would have been a good thing. Maybe it wouldn't have. It sure didn't turn out to be one for Michael Beale, who ultimately ended up kind of letting himself down with his loyalty that he spoke of in that famous interview now with QPR, having rejected our overtures and ended up going to Rangers. And QPR season obviously went and hit a bit of a slide off the back of that. But ultimately it led us to bringing Lopetegui into the team. Now, all at the point that he joined, obviously it's well documented, 10 points from 15 games, I think it was, going into the World Cup. Had an opportunity to kind of take stock, have a look at the squad, a January transfer window on the horizon as well. And it was a really good opportunity, considering it was mid-season, for a manager to come in and really kind of stamp their authority on the group. There was a trip away. Obviously, some players weren't available due to World Cup commitments and things like that. But he had the benefit of that, and straight away you could tell that his priority was bringing about a better home record, bringing about clean sheets, and making sure that that was where we prioritised getting points, essentially. Now, first game was in the cup against Gillingham, that notwithstanding. But in terms of a Premier League point of view, the first game that we'd had under Lopetegui was away against Everton, and we actually won a game, having gone behind for the first time since before Bruno Lage had been manager. That shouldn't be underestimated in terms of, a manager being able to kind of cajole his players into a result. There was tactics changes throughout Lopetegui's reign within games. In that particular one, I think he reverted to a back three, having started a back four, and that brought about a little bit more space to counter on, and we ended up scoring that winner on the counter with Ait Nouri. He used all of his substitute allocations for the most part in every game. I think he had issues with the fitness levels of the squad, which probably goes back to the way Lage set up in pre-season and how he wanted the team to play. It is a kind of well-trodden line from managers coming in mid-season that players aren't running enough, players aren't fit enough, etc., etc. It's one of those things that kind of sits well with fans, that it's something that can kind of come in and stamp their authority on instantly. But as the season went on, I think you started to see the good and the bad of Lopetegui. The away record was appalling, despite a couple of come from behind wins against Southampton and Everton, against the odds against Southampton with 10 men as well. But his tinkering, his man management of certain players, I think, were left a little bit to be desired in terms of the way he seemed to bring players in, take them out of the team, then they'd have a spell on the sidelines, and it was just a little bit temperamental at times. He did, I think, really take advantage of scoring the first goal in games. That was something that we weren't really doing to begin with at the start of the season. And when we did tend to go into the lead, we weren't losing it. We were keeping hold of leads, and essentially those fine margins were falling in our favour a little bit more towards the second half of the season. But he also obviously had the massive benefit of a really good January transfer window. Craig Dawson, Mario Lemina, Mateus Cunha, even Daniel Bentley and João Gomes coming in as well. Obviously, Pablo Sarabia played a part as well. But 6 January signings is more than anybody has had since Fosun have joined the club. It is clearly something that was going to benefit Lopetegui, and he can really point to those signings and say that they made the difference in helping us secure our position within the league. Craig Dawson and Mario Lemina, for me, kind of the real standouts in that regard. Mateus Cunha as well, who, whilst he didn't necessarily threaten the goal scoring sheet too often, he had a really good season, and I think will be a key player for us going forward. But yeah, it's I think it's pretty well known that I'm not necessarily his biggest fan. I didn't see too much from a tactical perspective that I found innovative or particularly interesting or even consistent. I don't really know what Lopetegui is trying to achieve with his team at the moment. Well, if he is trying to achieve anything with his team at the moment, obviously with the question marks over his future at the club. But his insistence on bringing in more signings, I think, is leaving a little bit of a sour taste for me, just because he had more resources than in one transfer window than Bruno Lage had in a couple. And ultimately, the manager's job is to coach your team and get more results out of them. he seems to have done that at home, but he can't seem to get a tune out of the team away from home, which doesn't stack up to me either, in the sense that lack of consistency to same group of players, it just doesn't really add up. And I think there's still a hell of a lot more to be expected from a manager who came in and was sold to us as an elite coach, really. So I'm waiting to be seen on what improvements he can make to this group for a start. Obviously, he seems to be insistent on new signings coming in, but I'll kind of come on to next season in a little while. But kind of some mitigating circumstances as well, it's worth bearing out. I've mentioned already the kind of late summer transfer activity. The Matheus Nunes saga rumbled on for far too long. There was this whole conversation about him holding out for Liverpool at the time, I remember, and maybe there was a deadline on that deal happening, and once that had crossed, then he was due to join Wolves or whatever it was that happened. Gonzalo Guedes as well came in quite late. That was all seemingly dependent on Morgan Gibbs-White going out. Obviously, we sold Leander Dendoncker as well. All these dealings kind of seemingly incumbent on ins and outs, all happening at the same time. Obviously, Raul Jimenez's fitness as well seemed to have a bearing on how we started the season, because we were basically without a central striker, having let Fabio Silva go out on loan. Now, the decision to let Silva go out on loan was good. He obviously ended up having a good season, but it makes you wonder if at Leeds on the opening day, had we kept him at the club, would he have had an impact on us winning that game potentially? Now, Jimenez's fitness as well ended up being quite a big concern. He went off injured in a pre-season friendly. That led to obviously us bringing Sasha Kaladzic in, and sod's law, he also gets injured on his debut. These are things that, whilst the medical department can take a certain level of responsibility for, you just can't legislate for that. And we ended up obviously bringing in Diego Costa as the stopgap from a centre forward perspective. And for the first half of the season, we essentially played without a striker. And it's no surprise that once we managed to get forwards within the team who were up to speed, up to the fitness levels required, our form took an upturn. And Lopetegui was again the man that benefited from that, alongside Matheus Cunha coming in as well in January. Other circumstances around it, so obviously Lopetegui Senior and his illness was a factor in the sense that we couldn't bring in Lopetegui Junior as quickly as we'd have liked, and maybe that 8 games under Steve Davis would have not had such an impact in terms of negative results, and we'd have been on a slightly better footing going into the World Cup. But ultimately, it didn't really matter. But at the end of the day, it still caused a lot of unease, a lot of frustration within the club that we weren't able to go and make a decision and actually take the club forward and get an understanding of where everyone stood. We all know about the referee controversies that have happened this season. I won't go into any details on them because it's been quite farcical for the most part. But a couple of other points that I think that would have stopped us from achieving a little bit more. Matheus Cunha getting injured against Fulham. I think for a start, we win that game if he stays on the pitch for the rest of it. I think we really fell off after he goes off. And I think for the most part, he was managing that injury for the rest of the season. There was images coming through of him with a protective boot on many times, just to kind of help with his recovery and things like that. So I don't think we actually saw him at 100% fitness for the rest of the season. There were games where he didn't start and he was in and out of the team and things like that. But when he did play, we were a better team for it. And I think once he gets a consistent run in the side next season, he's going to be a really big player for us. And the other one was Jose Sarr. He had an unbelievable season last year in terms of keeping goals out. But his regression to the mean really was what caused maybe some concern. There were a few mistakes in there. Even the opening day, we go we get pegged back to 1-1 as a result of firstly an Nuri mistake, but Sarr getting beaten at his near post, and little things kind of crept into his game with that, and especially some issues with the ball at his feet. But again, a 13th place finish, given where we were, you can't necessarily complain too much. But I do want to have a very brief look ahead to next season. Obviously, spoken about how much uncertainty there is because Lopetegui hasn't necessarily given assurances about his future at the club. Talked about FFP concerns that he wasn't aware of. So essentially, we're on a bit of a situation where we don't know whether we can bring players in at this moment in time. Now, what I've done, I've kind of laid out the squad with some caveats and highlights to point out players who are contracted to the club, who might have a future, might not have a future, might be out on loan. Decisions need to be made on their future and things like that. But essentially, we could be going into the season with something like this. I've kind of laid the players out in what I would ostensibly say the position that they would play if we were playing in the 4-4-2 that Lopetegui used to a good degree of success for the second half of this season. And I think the feeling for me is that whilst every manager has the right to kind of insist on bringing players in, wanting to play a certain way and trying to get their own stamp on this team, on this squad, and work with their players, and in that meaning that they are, doing themselves justice. I think within this group, if you was to kind of take a step back, understand who's on the contract, who is committed to the club and whatnot, you have, I think, a mid-table Premier League squad within this group that is on screen right now. I don't think a competent coach achieves less than mid-table with this group, whichever way you want to spin it in terms of who you're playing where, formations, tactics, all that. This is potentially, obviously numbers-wise, this is a little bit on the heavy side in terms of what you'd probably want to go into the start of pre-season with. But this is potentially the group that we could start next season with. I don't think this is a bad team at all. And I think a manager who is a coach first and who wants to improve players first and foremost without kind of insisting on players coming into the squad, can work with this and can turn this into a team that plays attractive football, that scores more goals than it has been, that is solid enough defensively, and that essentially brings back some of the feeling that the fans have missed for the last 3 seasons now. Well, since before COVID, which tells you how long it's been since Wolves fans have really enjoyed going to watch their team. I think that it's disappointing to think that we might be on a bit of, and well, not solid ground essentially at the moment from a managerial perspective, but I think Bosen are within their rights to say we have a lot of assets at the club. We spent quite, not wildly, but we spent quite heavily in January to ensure we maintained the Premier League status of the club, and obviously that's been delivered now. But when you look at it from an assets perspective and an investment perspective, the club the owners have done enough, I think, to suggest that they got a better return on what they've had. I still don't think we're anywhere near getting to Europe. Obviously, the arrival of Newcastle and the likes of Brighton, featuring higher up the table now, even Villa potentially getting up there now, it's becoming a bit more of a closed shop. So for me, all I'd want to see next season is better football, an interesting style of play, and getting more out of what we've already got at the club. We've got a load of interesting young players coming through, like Fabio Silva, João Gomez, Boubacar Traoré, Nathan Collins, really, really good, talented players who shouldn't be discarded. Essentially, I think that's my concern, that we're going to bin off a load of players who could go on to work elsewhere. Now, we've seen certain players we know that aren't that it's never necessarily worked with. Someone like Morgan Gibbs White, it was never necessarily going to work at Molineux for him. He's gone to Forest. He's done what they need him to do, really. But I think we're in a situation now where we need to try and capitalise and get a little bit more out of the current group. Put our arms around him a little bit, make them feel better, and essentially play much more attractive football. And the results will start to come, I think. But the first and foremost is nailing down who's going to be running the team next season. So over to you then, Ewan, and let us know what you plan on doing.